Hello, and welcome to The Way to Soul Consciousness. My name is David Hopper. This is my first recording of a podcast series, and my background basically is I've studied the esoteric or spiritual teachings known as the ageless wisdom, which I'll get into as we go into these podcasts. I'll get into more detail, but basically I have a theosophical background, and which talks about the concept of all the major religions and philosophies coming together from all the great teachers and spiritual teachers down the ages. I'll be talking about this in much more detail as we go on in this series. The first podcast, I want to talk about several different concepts as an introduction, and this is basically the way to soul consciousness is for those people who are not soul conscious, which is the vast majority of humanity. And I'll explain why that is as we go on too. It's the idea that we want to awaken within ourselves. And the awakening concept is the idea there comes a life when you may sense something within your consciousness, which is greater than yourself. Perhaps you're sensing your soul, your higher or spiritual self, maybe even divinity itself. When this happens, you awaken to something greater than your life and trouble and difficulties that most of humanity share. And during this time of awakening, it's a time for discovering how the greater self, which I am calling the soul, expresses and influences you in so many ways while acting as a background in consciousness. So why does the soul need to do this? It is your personality that is incarnated by the soul with one primary purpose, and that's to expand your consciousness and eventually evolve into a sense of oneness with the divine. So let me unpack that a little bit. We're talking about your sense of oneness. It means you have a wholeness of yourself, your sense of you are part of the divine itself too, and you act as part of the divine. And how are you going to do that? Well, I'll be talking about this in an entire series. And to get to this point of awareness, this way to soul consciousness, you need to clear away anything that blocks you from a direct connection with this sense of the divine. And although the teachings described here are based on theosophical perspective and other ageless wisdom sources, it invites people from all beliefs, all backgrounds, to learn about their spiritual self. If you happen to have previous religious training, perhaps mystical or even religious experience, and want to know what it means or even want to deepen your experience, these teachings can possibly work for you. While these experiences may stimulate your interest, it is recommended not to let attachments, such as religious dogma or the limitation of a particular teaching, keep you from learning a new way to connect with your authentic or natural self. By embracing a spiritual attitude, that is, you're open to connecting with your deeper self, this approach will take you further on a path of discovery and eventual liberation. We're talking about the concept of liberation. We're talking about the idea of we have this physical plane existence and that there's much more beyond the physical plane existence than just what we've been used to as far as connecting with people just in the outer world in our regular life, which we call the physical plane. As you embark on this journey, you want to discover who you are. And that's the concept that we call in the teachings called know thyself. And this actually can go back to Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass, for example, and where she came across the caterpillar. She was immersed in a dream and trying to wake up. And the caterpillar kept asking her several times. He says, "Who are you?" And the author of this was Lewis Carroll. The author was a theosophist. So the meaning of this concept of knowing who you are, know thyself, is about when you set off on a new journey, spiritual discovery in this case, is discovering who you are. you have a sense of who you are, and at least as a personality. That's as a sense of the personality on the physical plane. Otherwise, you're confused and you have no direction to follow. So on this journey, you have to need to frequently ask the question, who am I? Initially, your personality, who you are, that's who you are right now, will act as a separated entity expressing a me-ness or I-ness in the world, all that you do. It's not integrated with the soul at this point, and it still is strongly identified with the lower mental, emotional, and physical parts of ourself, and is driven by physical desires and emotional reactivity to the world. I'll be talking about the lower three vehicles that we call the mental, emotional, physical. I'll be talking about these in a podcast very soon. One of the early injunctions, as I mentioned, for the aspirant, the one who aspires, is to understand the concept of know thyself. This concept is important as you need to know who you are as a personality level and how you express or learning to express soul qualities in the world. Right human relations, getting along with people, cooperation and expressing goodwill, understanding. There's a wholeness to this entire concept of the personality in relation of the soul, and then oneness for becoming the soul. So if the person does not know who he or she is, they'll potentially wander around recklessly, as I mentioned, and lacking direction. And for lifetimes, this whole concept that we're talking about here in philosophy is based on the concept of reincarnation, yes. And for lifetimes, the incarnating personality treads the path of acquiring experience and understanding, and through all sorts of interactions and encounters and situations in the world, the personality immerses him or herself in experience. And why do they do this? After lifetimes of acquired experience, the soul desires to learn and evolve through its lower correspondence, the personality. So the soul is what incarnates multiple times over hundreds or thousands of years, and it creates a personality each time. And you're born up, of course, into a different family, culture, understanding, and then you learn from that point of view, but you still have the soul is consistent through all your incarnations. And so you may be asking the question during your incarnation, it says, who am I and what is my purpose? And in time, if you're spiritually inclined or you have an awakening, as we initially started talking about, you come to a deeper level of understanding that you are on a spiritual path and that life has meaning and purpose. A major concept to grasp in this philosophy or understanding here in this perspective is that your personality learns to get soul perspective and understanding through an incarnation, as I mentioned. And we work with what's called the objective and subjective realities. Now let's separate those out there. For the vast majority of people in our materialistic civilization or world, regardless of culture, life revolves around the five senses and what we call the rational, concrete thinking states. What we can see, what we can taste, feel, hear, etc., that's all there is in reality. The individual acts as a separated personality. I'm my own individual self from the other 8 billion souls out there in incarnation. And there's an overt and there's a world of objectivity, which is known as materialistically understand as the truth, and it is the only reality. So this connection with the soul is weak and it's not part of your awareness at this point. So what we're moving here toward is expanding our awareness, making a connection with the inner planes of ourself, the inner mind. You close your eyes and you have that dark space, and that space is who you are, but it's asking questions and going deeper and inquiring about who you are in your natural state. In the objective reality, you interact with the world using your personality and your physical body form, nature, through the expression of your own ideas, perspective, biases, interpretations, opinions, and feelings. So this is who you are as a personality. You're not connected with the soul at this point. Now, for the spiritual seeker, the subjective or inner world is seen as the source where thought and impressions emanate from the soul. Impressions are just as they sound like. I just got an impression of something. Or I see this person, and whether on television or I get a sense of them on the radio or maybe even on this podcast, you get a sense listening to my voice. You get an impression or an idea that comes to you. So an impression acts as a force that influences your mind. And knowing that your lower mind is made up of concepts of rational thinking mind, whereas the soul is the highest point of your mind. And we're going to get into the different parts of the mind here. So just let's follow this train of thought going on here. So we understand in this teaching that the lower mind is made up of the concrete or rational thinking mind, the part that discriminates and separates and identifies things, whereas the soul is the highest part of the mind, and that is what we ultimately, as a spiritual seeker, wish to unite with. The mind consists of the abstract mind and has a direct connection with the higher spiritual part of ourself, which will even get beyond the soul there, and we'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later. Initially, when contact with the soul begins, the individual is inspired with a sense of duty and responsibility. For the individual spiritual seeker, the connection with the soul helps you to develop a fine sense of discrimination, and you learn to distinguish between energy meaning thoughts and feelings, and force, such as your will, as subjective energies of the soul that impinge on your consciousness. And over time, your individual awareness will become fine-tuned. You come to know the difference between the use of the mind and thought and free will as a force, and also allowing the difference of the energies will be coming from the soul as an influence. So a recap here of this. We understand that there is different parts of the mind. There's the objective world that we talked about initially, the physical plane, dense world that we see all around us with the five senses, and we have the inner world. With our mind, we connect with the soul, and we'll talk about how we do that later on. It'll basically be through meditation, the best way. But there's the parts of the mind. There is the lower mind, which connects with the physical plane reality and discriminates and has a rational thinking mind. And there's the higher mind, and that's the soul. And the part of that is the abstract mind, which we'll talk about in detail later. Now, I've mentioned the soul in different contexts so far, but let me provide a relatively brief definition. For the purpose of these podcasts, I will define the soul as the intermediary or agent of our pure spirit, known as the monad. The monad is our pure spirit. It resides between the monad and the lower planes where we exist. We live in a physical plane, we have an emotional level of ourself, and we have a mental level of ourself. This is part of the plane of existence. In theosophical terms, it's referring to the cosmic physical plane. So we live on these lower planes, and the monad lives in a much higher plane, even beyond the soul. The soul resides between the monad and lower planes, and therefore it mediates and it relates them together. So it relates the higher planes of the monad, which is a plane of pure spirit, involving a pure aspect of will, a pure aspect of love and wisdom and goodwill, higher aspect of these. And it's also the highest aspect of the mind, which is our soul. That's where the soul connects. And that area is called the spiritual triad. That's the lowest part of the monad that expresses itself on the higher part of the cosmic physical plane. So the soul's consciousness extends to the lower planes. The soul is our guide throughout our incarnation. And it extends to the lower planes and to the vehicles, the mental, emotional, and the physical. and it is known as the threefold personality. So these mental, emotional, and physical are known as the threefold personality. These three vehicles, parts of ourselves, have a higher correspondence, what's called the spiritual triad, as I mentioned. And these are known as the Atma, that was the will aspect of the monad, the Buddhi, the lower, higher correspondence to our emotional nature, and the Manas, which is a higher correspondence to our mental nature. These are terms that come from, they're theosophical terms you'll find in theosophical literature, and they're basically Sanskrit terms, ancient Indian language. Our pure spirit, the monad, is the pinnacle of human experience and represents the spark of divinity within us. The soul has a connection with it through the higher mental plane, as I mentioned. Now, prior to soul integration, that is, the personality is separated and it doesn't have a connection with the soul yet. So the personality exists in a very subjective or physical existence, that is, with the thoughts and emotions and feelings, and it interacts with the density of matter through the five senses. Density of matter is all the physical objects around us, our furniture, our walls, the street, our car, whatever. Those are all physical objects of interaction we have. Personality learns, it gains experience, and it acquires wisdom over lifetimes. And it has relationships with others through work, family, romantic liaisons, and many other personal and impersonal encounters. Separated simply means that the mind and the consciousness are almost always separated from direct experience of the pure spirit. So it is the personality which is evolving via the soul or from the soul. The soul is the onlooker always with us. So the personality is gaining experience. It has all these different interactions and it learns, and then it stores this information in its being. And then upon death, that information is taken back from the personality and it remains in the soul consciousness. The soul, as the agent of the monad, our pure spirit, remains throughout many, many dozens, hundreds of lifetimes, which we've been experiencing for a long time, each one of us. And it evolves through our personality. We use the concept of separation, meaning that the mind and the consciousness of the personality are almost separated from direct experience of the soul and pure spirit until there is a time of awakening when the person feels that they want to connect with a deeper part of themselves, which I'm calling the soul. Now, the Ageless Wisdom teachings describe the journey of the soul beginning through a process of what's called individualization. This information is articulated and described in detail by Helena Blavatsky, a Russian mystic from the 19th century, and she wrote a seminal book called The Secret Doctrine in the late 19th century. And she talked about how the spark, what was called the spark of mind or thinking capacity, was imbued into man. And in the beginning, this took place a long, long time ago. In the beginning, this spark gave man the first sense of the separate I. This man existed long time ago for untold lifetimes with no particular purpose except to acquire experience and a measure of understanding about who and what he is. He went on for multiple incarnations, and the spark of mind initially drove him to have, through his concept of instinct, to work with the material form of the physical plane. So he learned, I guess we could say, the hunting and gathering. It took place. This was thousands of years ago, and the mind started developing, gaining experiences. So until that point, the mind of man was spiritually undeveloped and only had a physical appetites. He was known as animal man. And over the eons, thousands of years, humans evolved from the strictly physical and emotional existence to where we are today. We are still quite emotional, but this mind that we have has evolved to be capable of integrating the highest aspects of our nature with the soul, and ultimately with the pure spirit known in Eastern teachings as the monad. The soul is neither spirit nor matter, but relates the spirit and matter together and acts as a vehicle or agent of the pure spirit. This journey covers hundreds of lifetimes, as I mentioned, and it's about establishing consciousness, awareness with that pure spirit throughout all planes of the cosmic physical plane. So let's step back a moment and realize that an understanding of human origins also relates to what has been called the hero's journey. Now, a parallel comparison in our culture through literature and storytelling describing the path of liberation and the journey of the soul is about the hero's journey. And although Joseph Campbell stated there were 17 stages of the hero's journey, I'm going to be summarizing for the sake of time the main characteristics of this journey. Of the journey of the soul or the hero are. And the first one, or the first major one, is called the call to adventure. And this is a metaphor, the call to adventure is a metaphor about the personality who is awakened. He or she senses they have a destiny and they've been summoned and they're changing their spiritual center of gravity to a place unknown. So like Siddhartha, the Buddha, he leaves the security of the castle to venture out into the unknown world. The next step would be the road of trials. And he goes through a series of tests and tasks and ordeals that he must undergo to begin transformation into his spiritual self. The emphasis here is on the spiritual seeker learns how to transcend his own limitations as the thoughts and feelings in his consciousness that hold him back. And we call this concept purification, which I will go into detail in the next podcast. The personality, or the hero in this case, learns to observe and to listen with his senses, and through purification, he eventually becomes an instrument of service. So his consciousness, his thinking capacity, his emotional nature, his sensitivity to life and life circumstances and activities, this is what he becomes an instrument for service about. Then there's a stage called apotheosis. This is the highest point of the development of the inner spiritual process. Here, the hero dies to the lower self to live in the higher spirit, and he moves to the state of divine love, compassion, and wisdom. In the end, the hero returns to the world or his home, having achieved mastery over the higher spiritual realms and the physical material world, with a newly acquired wisdom gained by his quest. So in our context, he shares his wisdom with individuals and groups for the benefit of humanity as an act of service. So in essence, to tread the spiritual path, as we're describing here, for the personality to unite with the soul, that's part of the spiritual path, the spiritual seeker must learn to integrate the separate forces of his personality, the mental, emotional, and physical, and see them all as working as one unit, and unite and become one in consciousness with them. This will then fulfill the soul's purpose in being an agent of service. Another concept to grasp about the soul is that the soul on its own plane, at its own level, is already group conscious. It is already a being that is holding people together in oneness and cooperation and goodwill and wanting to bring community together. It is our personality that separates and makes difficulties in that way. So we talked about the soul is made up of the mind. It has what's called an etheric or a vital body. The etheric body has chakras in it, which you may have heard of before from Eastern teachings. Chakra means energy vortices. We We have 7 major chakras, which I'll talk about in a future podcast. And we have, of course, our emotional nature. Physical body is known as an automaton. It is just a instrument or through which the soul and the personality can have interaction with the physical plane. It doesn't have a consciousness of its own. It is our brain and our personality and the soul together that gives the physical body animation. At the soul level, the personality can simultaneously manifest as individualistic and universal. So that means that you, the personality, can, in your consciousness, ultimately reach a higher divine level and have a greater divine capacity in your nature. The soul transfers the principles of sentiency, the life energy, and intelligence to its lesser reflection, the personality. This is demonstrated through the mind and mental awareness, which gives man the power to discriminate and analyze activities on its physical plane. Remember, it's the power, the concrete mind, the rational mind, it separates, it naturally does this. From this, the personality gains experience and progresses on the path of development through impulses by the soul. Impulses is another word for impression also. When the mind of man, personality, is sufficiently developed, the mind has 2 expressions, the lower concrete mind and the higher spiritual and abstract mind. Concrete mind allows the personality to analyze and discriminate, as we mentioned, and connect with all expressions and kingdoms of the physical plane. The abstract mind is a bridge, and it's a part of man's higher mental nature and acts as a connection with the soul and permits the personality to comprehend the principles of universal brotherhood, synthesis, and absolute reality. So it is that abstract nature, that abstract mind of part of ourself, which connects with that higher part of ourself known as the spiritual triad I mentioned before, the Atma, the Buddhi, and the Manas, that part which connects with that lower part of the lowest aspect of the monad. When enough of the higher energy of mind or an awareness and sentiency permeates the lower personality through the abstract mind, it produces a vibration so potent that there's a fusion of the higher spirit and matter. The result is the blending of life, body, quality, and appearance through the tangible human form. Man's spiritual development and expanded consciousness is facilitated through life experiences, and the soul provides man with a sense of continuity between successive incarnations. So the soul holds this consciousness of what it learns from one incarnation to the next. It acquires wisdom in the personality, and when the person dies, the personality, the essence, the highest essence of the personality is absorbed back into the soul, and the soul stores that until the next incarnation. So for the conscious spiritual seeker, he practices what is called in esotericism as love wisdom. Eventually, love wisdom is a conscious act of loving. So there has to be a certain mental awareness, awakening of the heart, the love energy, and of course, a awakening of the mind energy. So there's an intelligence about loving wisdom, loving intelligently, which means going out and doing service intelligently and applying your energies toward helping people. Eventually, the soul evolves to a place and the personality together where they are living divinely embodied life, and in so doing, they help others do the same. This is service. So thus, he is intentionally participating in his own evolution. That's way down the road. That's nearing the end of the path of liberation. And actually, I've used the term liberation. What does liberation mean? It means you're liberating from the limitations of this physical matter. We have to be an incarnation. We have to have bodies. We have to have experiences and everything, but we don't have to be limited by separation from other people and situations where we can evolve and help things evolve better. So the liberation from the lower matter of the hatred, the bigotry, the selfishness, and all the selfish separation. These are the things that we consider to be the lower energies that we want to separate from. This is the lower matter that must be purified. And I'll be coming back to this theme and this idea many times during these podcasts. So, a major objective of the soul over its many, many lifetimes, as we might call it, is to replace the lower energies of the threefold personality, that is, the mental, the physical, the emotional, with its corresponding agents of the spiritual triad, the Atma, the Buddhi, and the Manas. So that, again, the Atma, Buddhi, and the Manas refer to the higher energies of the monad, which have been extended, and the soul has extended its personality with those lower correspondences, and eventually the two will merge together and purify the lower aspect. This will be done through a process of purification over many lifetimes. So this process enables the consciousness of the personality to expand and evolve over time. It's an evolutionary process of change that you are learning to be consciously part of. Once connected with the soul, performing service is a natural expression toward fulfilling the soul's purpose. It should be noted that religious and spiritual traditions have a very different view of the existence of the soul. Buddhism sees the soul as a creation of the mind. Although Christianity and Judaism acknowledge the soul, they do not recognize the concept of an innate divinity of the soul. In this philosophy, basically theosophical origins and understanding, man is and always has had a divine nature. We have a kernel of divinity within every single one of us. And we have that capacity and possibility of connecting with the divine. It's a long journey of awakening to this fact, and discovering what the process of awakening is about is what our journey is about and what we're doing, if we are conscious in what we do. Now, I've talked about the soul and its origins and the personality, but let's understand that they exist within a much greater context of evolution at the planetary and solar system level. The Ageless Wisdom Teachings, this is basically going back to Blavatsky in the late 1880s in her book, The Secret Doctrine, basically present an understanding that divine inspiration comes from solar and cosmic sources. The inspiration is a type of knowledge and energy that is stepped down into what is called the plan or the divine plan. The plan is a blueprint of energy formula expressing light and love and the will to good for humanity of all kingdoms. And just as a side note here, for getting a more perspective, when I mentioned light and love and the will to good, we're talking about the three major aspects of divinity or God that have been revealed to man. In its most basic form, it is a thought expressing the three major divine aspects working out in humanity. Again, namely will, love, and active intelligence. And these are all part of what the monad is, the three major aspects of the monad I mentioned. The plan for humanity is guided by a group of advanced souls or ascended masters who, just as us, have suffered, incarnated, and eventually achieved liberation from the physical plane and the cycle of rebirth. They are called the hierarchy, or known as the spiritual hierarchy, and they act as custodians of God's plan for working out on earth. The Christ and the Buddha are part of the hierarchy, including numerous other members, including masters and sages and mystics and saints from all cultures and religions and beliefs of all over the ages. The hierarchy as custodians of the plan provide a blueprint for personal and planetary evolution by conveying to spiritual seekers via impression. Remember, we mentioned impression is a registered the same way as you just got an impression or something or somebody of somebody or something. It is often associated with inspiration, guidance, impulse, incentive, influence, and aspiration. So an impression also acts as an idea, a stimulation, energy, or force communicated to the individual's consciousness. So we have these great beings. Basically, they're known as the kingdom of souls. The hierarchy is known as the kingdom of souls. And we are all part of this too, although we do not know this yet. It's like that is part of the path of evolution and to awakening the entire soul's nature and connecting with the soul to have a full realization of this fact. In all cultures and nations around the world, individuals are interpreting the plan through their activities by practicing higher values, as I mentioned before, such as goodwill, cooperation, and harmlessness through thought and action. Although impressions are never imposed on individuals and humanity, we must become conscious agents in human evolution for enabling God's plan. Eventually, the energies of cooperation and goodwill will become a primary expression in all human affairs. This will ensure a world and civilization maintained through mutual benefit and not by an imposed authority or utopian dream. In short, by combining the heart and the mind in this way, this is a major expression of the plan, the divine plan, for our stage of evolution. As more and more people embrace and live these values, eventually these spiritual values will result in a paradigm shift in consciousness where humanity will be reoriented from emotional reactivity to a more mental, rational understanding, still with the emotions of love and cooperation and goodwill and understanding, but move humanity towards practicing right human relations. In other words, expressing love and wisdom in all our activities and interactions with each other. We'll conclude this podcast by talking about something I mentioned, the ageless wisdom. Since ancient times, a vast body of spiritual teachings has been handed down to each generation, known as the ageless wisdom. These teachings come from an ancient source or sources such as the Vedas, the Upanishads, Taoism, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vishnu Puranas, and many more. More modern sources include Theosophy, Anthroposophy, the Kabbalah, Rosicrucian, Hermetic, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the Bible, the Quran, and the writings of Alice Bailey and Helena Blavatsky. The wisdom does not belong to any one culture, race, or people. It is made up of occult and esoteric writings and information about the evolution of man's consciousness. It provides an understanding of how our universe came into being and our place in it. Its foundations, we know, are based in esotericism or the science of working with energy and force. In the Ageless Wisdom or Wisdom Teachings, we describe the laws of the divine, which make up all matter and forces and energies in the manifested and unmanifested universe. In essence, all that is seen and not seen. These teachings tell a story that man is much more than his limited three-dimensional bodies. That is, his mental, emotional, and physical, that make up his existence. We'll conclude this podcast by talking about something I mentioned, the ageless wisdom. Since ancient times, a vast body of spiritual teachings has been handed down to each generation, known as the ageless wisdom. These teachings come from an ancient source or sources such as the Vedas, the Upanishads, Taoism, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vishnu Puranas, and many more. More modern sources include Theosophy, Anthroposophy, the Kabbalah, Rosicrucian, Hermetic, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the Bible, the Quran, and the writings of Alice Bailey and Helena Blavatsky. The wisdom does not belong to any one culture, race, or people. It is made up of occult and esoteric writings and information about the evolution of man's consciousness. It provides an understanding of how our universe came into being and our place in it. Its foundations, we know, are based in esotericism or the science of working with energy and force. In the Ageless Wisdom or Wisdom teachings, we describe the laws of the divine, which make up all matter and forces and energies in the manifested and unmanifested universe. In essence, all that is seen and not seen. These teachings tell a story that man is much more than his limited three-dimensional bodies. That is, his mental, emotional, and physical, that make up his existence. But to recognize and come to know his divinity, we must undergo trials of discovery and transformation so we can remove blocks that allow for clear seeing. Ageless Wisdom teachings are those teachings that show man his true nature and leads him to know that greater self. The most viable teachings, regardless of culture, will encourage the student, the spiritual student or aspirant, to make haste slowly or to practice moderation. This means to be cognizant of one's own aspirations and types of spiritual practices he becomes interested in. This will teach the aspirant to be mindful or aware of his own process of transformation and not go off half-cocked and be swept away by the new ism he is learning. Many spiritual teachings embrace the concept that we acquire knowledge and understanding through the law of cause and effect. Eastern teachings describe this as karma. The Bible interprets this as you sow, so shall you reap. We understand that every action and deed we perform initiates a cause that leads to an effect. Eventually, we become aware of this dynamic process and make better choices to not only stop creating any negative karma, but actually become the conscious creator for positive karma. Through mastery of this law, we become the master of forces and energies within our own being and ultimately through society, and eventually manifest it through our own innate divinity. The concept of the ageless wisdom will be addressed frequently in many podcasts going forward. But to recognize and come to know his divinity, we must undergo trials of discovery and transformation so we can remove blocks that allow for clear seeing. Ageless Wisdom teachings are those teachings that show man his true nature and leads him to know that greater self. The most viable teachings, regardless of culture, will encourage the student, the spiritual student or aspirant, to make haste slowly or to practice moderation. This means to be cognizant of one's own aspirations and types of spiritual practices he becomes interested in. This will teach the aspirant to be mindful or aware of his own process of transformation and not go off half-cocked and be swept away by the new ism he is learning. Many spiritual teachings embrace the concept that we acquire knowledge and understanding through the law of cause and effect. Eastern teachings describe this as karma. The Bible interprets this as you sow, so shall you reap. We understand that every action and deed we perform initiates a cause that leads to an effect. Eventually, we become aware of this dynamic process and make better choices to not only stop creating any negative karma, but actually become the conscious creator for positive karma. Through mastery of this law, we become the master of forces and energies within our own being and ultimately through society, and eventually manifest it through our own innate divinity.